Senator Cotton is next.
Ms. Gupta, I want to return to a troubling exchange you had with Senator Cornyn. He asked you, simple question, is it true that you advocate for the decriminalization of all drugs? You said, simply, no, sir, I do not. He asked you to clarify, and then you said, Senator, I've advocated, as I believe President Biden has, for the decriminalization of marijuana possession. You went on and said, I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs. Yet, Ms. Gupta, in an op-ed published in September of 2012 in the Huffington Post, you wrote, quote, states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana and for small amounts of other drugs. Ms. Gupta, why did you mislead Senator Cornyn in this committee?
Senator, I was not misleading. I'm speaking for my position today after having been at the Justice Department, after having family members and experiences inform my thinking on this. I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs. I have spoken about substance use issues and drug possession and substance use disorders as both a public health problem and an enforcement problem. And I continue to believe that very much as both a public health problem and substance use.
So thank you. He didn't ask what the position of the Department of Justice is. He asked, is it true that you advocate for the decriminalization of all drugs? And you said, under oath, no, sir, I do not. You published an op-ed plainly advocating for, quote, the decriminalizing simple possession of all drugs.
Senator,
you did not say, I've changed my mind. You did not say, my thinking has matured. You said, no, sir, I do not, under oath. If that's not a misleading answer, Ms. Gupta, what is?
Senator, not to pick apart words, but as I understood the question, it was about my present advocacy position on these issues. I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs.
So you've changed your position since that op-ed in 2012. You no longer support the decriminalization of all drugs.
I don't.
Thank you. Let's move to another exchange you had with Senator Cornyn. Last summer, 9 months ago, you were in front of this committee, and Senator Cornyn said, do you believe that all Americans are racist? You replied, yes, I think that we all have implicit biases and racial biases. Yes, I do. So, Ms. Gupta, I ask you, against which races do you harbor racial bias?
Senator Cotton, I do not. The yes was to say that all of us have implicit bias. This was an exchange also that Judge Garland had with Senator Kennedy during his hearing. I believe that we all have implicit bias. It doesn't mean that we are harboring any racism at all. These are unconscious assumptions and stereotypes that can get made. And I remember that summer in the exchange with Senator Cornyn that we were discussing systemic racism and implicit bias, and my response was to say that all of us have implicit bias.
Well, to be precise, you said we all have implicit biases and racial biases. That's all. Every single American you accused of implicit bias and racial bias. So I'm asking you again, against which races do you harbor racial bias?
I am quite aware that I know that I hold stereotypes that I have to manage. I'm a product of my culture. I'm a product, it's part of the human condition. And I believe that, one of the reasons I believe that all of us are able to manage implicit bias, but only if we can acknowledge our own. And I am not above anyone else in that matter. I think implicit bias is something that is part of the shared human condition.
So in the Trump administration, you strongly opposed the nominations to the federal courts of the following persons: Patrick Bumate, Michael Park, and Ada Brown, a Filipino-American, a Korean-American, and an African-American. Should members of those communities be worried that you harbor racial bias against them since you oppose those judges' nominations?
I'm not sure I see how that connection is being made, Senator. The Leadership Conference for decades has reviewed the civil rights records of individual judicial nominees in Democratic and Republican administrations. And there were judges that we opposed based on their civil rights record and a complete review. There was one set of judges that the Leadership Conference opposed because they simply refused to say that Brown versus Board of Education was the law of the land, and that seemed untenable for a judicial nominee, but it was based on a review of the record, and that was the basis, that was the advice and letters that we would send to the Senate. There were about a quarter of the nominees that President Trump put forth that the Leadership Conference opposed, but it was always after a thorough review of their record.
So it's your position then you can oppose someone's nomination on the merits without immediately and justly being accused of being racist or sexist because of their race or their sex?
Sorry, Senator, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at.
I'm getting at the point that our Democratic friends and many in the media often make whenever a senator opposes a nominee, they immediately jump to charges of racism. Such as, for instance, some people accuse Joe Manchin of being racist and sexist for opposing Neera Tanden's nomination. Can you oppose the nomination of a woman or a racial minority on the merits without being racist or sexist?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's move on to another exchange you had with Senator Cornyn. You've had a lot of great exchanges with Senator Cornyn. You also said in response to a question about institutional racism, there is not an institution in this country that isn't suffering from institutional racism. There's not an institution in this country. Ms. Gupta, does the Biden White House suffer from institutional racism?
Senator, given the history of this country, of slavery and the long period of Jim Crow and the ongoing scourge of racial discrimination, I think that it remains very much a live problem in America today, and that the effort to address racial discrimination in all of its forms, discrimination of any sorts, is something that all of us have to work at in the institutions we are a part of. And one of the reasons why I will be honored to return to the Justice Department if confirmed is that the Justice Department was actually founded on this objective of ensuring equal justice before the law. And the laws that Congress has enacted through the sacrifice and loss of life of Black Americans and Americans writ large, that is a kind of core function of the Justice Department, is to enforce our federal civil rights laws and to fight discrimination where it happens for all Americans.
So I'll just have the record reflect. I asked you simply, does the Biden White House suffer from institutional racism, and you didn't want to respond. My time is up here. I'll just say that I don't think you harbor racial bias towards any racial group or that you believe the Biden White House suffers from institutional racism. But when you throw around allegations that every single American suffers from racial bias and every single institution suffers from institutional racism, you open yourself up to these kinds of questions by condemning your fellow Americans without individualized evidence of their beliefs, their words, or their deeds. I think these statements were beyond the pale. I don't think really anybody truly believes them, nor should they be believed because they are so preposterous.